Hello everyone, Paulino here, and I'm glad to see you again. Let's face it, we have all made mistakes, right? For example, back in 2007, I thought it was going to be a great idea to get a mohawk haircut. Yeah, as you can see, that was clearly a mistake, a huge mistake. Anyway, but the best thing about making mistakes is that we can always learn something from them. With that in mind, in today's video, I want to go back to my first texturing project that I finished back in school and explore 3 workflow mistakes that I've made back then. Don't get me wrong, I was quite happy with the result of this project. In fact, Wasp was the main reason why I wanted to become a texture artist in the first place. But I want to approach these flaws from a perspective of a production workflow. The way I textured this piece worked just fine for a still illustration, but if you want to work in the VFX industry, if you want to work on a pipeline, there are many other things that you have to consider. When I opened my Mari archive, I noticed that some of the concepts that I failed to understand back then were also happening on many student projects that I've seen recently. I hope this video can help you avoid these mistakes on your own texture work and get you prepared to work in a VFX pipeline. And before we begin, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this video with your friends. Your support is always and truly appreciated, okay? So let's do it. The first thing I noticed here when I opened my project, as you can see I have my diffuse on the side, was that I didn't use any triplanar or tileables at all. Most of these color textures, they were projected into paint layers. And if we isolate that, you can see what I'm talking about. Yeah, so instead of using tileables, I just projected straight into the UVs. The biggest problem with this approach is what we call a destructive workflow. So if I have any UV or model adjustment here, I'm probably going to lose a lot of my work. Of course, some projects might rely more on projections than others. So with organic texture work, for example, it's really hard to avoid them. And on the hard surface assets, we might need to paint specific details such as decals or other damage masks. But for base textures like this ones, it doesn't make any sense since we can achieve better results with tileables and procedurals. So to give an example, here I have this layer where I projected this texture straight into the UVs. I think I just grabbed this and I probably did some projections like this. We can achieve the same exact result by creating a tile layer. So I'm just gonna create this and then just gonna drag and drop. See, you get the same result plus the benefit of changing the size that we want. So we don't have to worry about resolution, and it would also conform to a new model when we bring that in. And I noticed that I've done this a lot in this project. So I just projected a lot of these textures instead of using masks. So if you want to avoid this mistake, try to use projections with a purpose, especially if they're not masks. This is going to save you a lot of time down the road. And in my opinion, a good texture workflow has a nice balance between projections and procedurals. Even though UVs might not always be the responsibility of a texture artist, I wanted to include this mistake here just so you can see how problematic it can be to having consistent UV resolution across your model. So I'm going to isolate this first layer again, and here we can see how the UV resolution changes across the model. Here you can see how we lose a lot of resolution and it gets quite blurry. And that's mainly because if we create a checkerboard, we can see how the resolution changes across. Let me just increase the amount of tiles. And here, this pipe doesn't have a lot of resolution if you compare to this part here with this fin. And this area here has way more resolution than this. And inside you can clearly see that it doesn't have any resolution. If I look at the UVs, yeah, we can see what's going on. So I think this part here is supposed to be this. So that's why it's so different. In some cases, we might not need the same resolution across the whole asset. Some hidden areas might have a smaller textile density, and that's okay. Here, for example, like if we have this floor that we're gonna barely see it in the final image, so I would probably scale that down. But if you're not 100% sure, avoid my mistake by keeping the visible parts of your objects with consistent UV sizes. And if you need to scale down some tiles, that's fine, but keep track of the percentage that you used. Later on, that's going to be super helpful for you if you want to scale up your textures. And the last mistake I want to discuss in this video with you is the lack of control that I noticed in this project. If we look at my diffuse channel here, we can see that instead of using masks, I baked all my damage detail into my color. After gaining more experience in texturing, I've learned that separating details into masks is one of the most effective ways to have more control during the shader development. Also, when we split these details into multiple masks, it's going to be much easier for us to share this detail across multiple channels. Here in my project, you can see that I had a hard time doing that, and I ended up creating a super simple spec and bump map. Because I didn't have any masks to work with, I created a simple spec channel by turning my diffuse into black and white. This method might work, but it is outdated and it doesn't give us any further control. You can avoid this mistake by using what I like to call the compositor's mindset. Think about compositing multiple details instead of baking it all into one channel. This approach will give you a lot of control, and it will be much easier for you to make any adjustments later. Now let's do our quick recap. The first mistake we talked about today was to rely too much on a destructive workflow. You can avoid this by having a good balance between projections and procedurals. The second mistake was inconsistent UV resolution across the project. Make sure to keep your UVs consistent if you want your textures to be sharp and nice. And the last mistake I mentioned was the lack of control. You can avoid this mistake by adopting what I call the compositor's mindset, which means separating your textures into masks as much as you can and using them in different channels across your project. And before we finish this video, I want you to keep in mind that there are many different ways to texture something. These are just some lessons that I've learned and methods that I developed from, learning from my friends, from my colleagues. But, you're going to develop your own workflows as you go and you get more experience. And as you saw today, even with all these flaws in my workflow, I still managed to get a project in the end that I really liked. It's about what works for you, but also thinking and working as a team. So that was it for today, guys. Thank you so much for being here. I had a blast revisiting Wasp's project. If you did as well, please leave a like, a comment, share this with your friends. And as always, I see you next week.